Good evening, everybody. Hello. My name's Alistair Roth. I'm Executive Director of AII Victoria. I'd like to start by briefly acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet and pay respects to elders past and present, and a very warm welcome to members, guests, those online. Thank you for joining us. So we're here to talk about why the Russian constitution matters, but broader than that. It's going to go broader than Russia. It's going to talk about wider strongman governance, and that's possibly got some relevance with news from over the water in the last week or so. So welcome back to three panelists. Now, Will Partlett, who is going to be talking about his book, Associate Professor at Melbourne Law School. He's been to AII Vic in the past to launch this book, but today we're going to launch this one, which is a friendlier hardback and more affordable version, and we have a bunch of them over here to sell and to sign. So if you haven't got one yet, please grab one. His panelists to help him discuss this topic, Dr. Robert Horvath, I'm going by the flyer, but anyway, Dr. Robert Horvath from La Trobe University. He's a specialist in Russian politics. You can tell he's good at what he does because he's been sanctioned by the Kremlin. And Peter Kuzmin, Russian anti-war activist, he's the official representative of the Anti-Corruption Foundation established by the late Alexei Navalny and his representative here, and great supporter of the Institute. So, Will, I'll hand over to you, and to Peter and Robert, thanks very much for coming to join us.
Thanks, Alistair. It's working? Yeah. Thanks for coming, guys. And we're going to do a kind of unusual book launch today. I'm not going to talk for too long. I'm just going to introduce the book very briefly and then hand over to Robert and Peter to talk through what after they've had a look at the book, what does it help them think through about when they think about Russia, when they think about authoritarianism, they think about broader questions of governance, and then we'll open up for Q&A. And as Alistair said, if you're interested in buying the book after this, then you can come over there, $35, 20%. That's a 20% discount on its retail price. Good little stocking stuffer, put it in the stocking. And it's as I say, and I will say a little bit before we go to Q&A about the impact and some of the way that the Russian story helps us understand a little bit about what could be happening in the United States very soon, about how arguments around centralization of power can be used to essentially thinly democratic arguments around the centralization of power are used to kind of create strongman personalistic forms of governance, and the role of a constitutional change in that. So broadly, what the book is doing is looking at this really dramatic and I think one of the most tragic stories of recent history, international history, which is how did Russia, a country that emerged from the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, early 1990s, with its extremely strong democratic movement. Millions of people take to the street across Russia to overthrow an authoritarian regime. How does it end up as we are today with a highly centralized, authoritarian, personalized government under Vladimir Putin, and Russia's at war with, has essentially invaded a sovereign country and started the largest war in Europe since World War II. How did we get here? What went wrong? And the conventional story is the one that focuses very much on the person of Vladimir Putin. And of course, I don't dispute that Vladimir Putin is very important in this story, but it focuses on how Putin himself has kind of returned Russia back to its traditional historical patterns and blah, blah, blah. And that, this story becomes one that we kind of can absolve ourselves in the West of what I argue in the book is our participation, and the participation in some cases of liberal political kind of thinking in the creation of a constitutional system that we got. So the story I tell, what I say is the real story, and it's a much less comfortable story for the West, is how Boris Yeltsin, who was the leader of the Russian liberal democratic movement, with very strong backing from his friend Bill Clinton in the United States and from the West, engaged in what I call the constitutional dark arts. And what does that mean? They built a constitutional system that guaranteed rights. Okay, so if you read the Russian Constitution, you're going to see in chapters 1 and chapters 2 rights, all kinds of, just dozens of them. And in many cases, this is what everyone was focusing on in the early 90s. They said, look, Russia's changed. It's got this constitution with all these rights in it. If you keep reading in the constitution, though, what you find is that the system of power that it creates, of authority, constitutional authority, is highly centralized. So what you get is a form of kind of liberal strongmanism, right? Which is what, or liberal dictatorship, whereby a highly empowered constitutionally president exists in a liberal system, or a system that has a lot of liberal rights and connections to international human rights law and so forth. So what really was a kind of disharmonic or really contradictory constitution. And the idea at the time was, well, there was some, it's like, okay, maybe the president has a little bit too much power, but first of all, we trust Boris Yeltsin. He's our man. He's our guy. He's going to create markets, free markets. We're going to get, this was the time of, the end of history. Fukuyama's article was, everyone's reading it, everyone's saying, well, and it was this kind of inevitability theory was going around the world where people were saying, well, if you get markets, democracy comes next, right? Free markets, capitalism leads to democracy. And the idea was that also that courts, okay, if the president got out of control, got too powerful, the courts would limit the power of the president. What we've seen since then is that this constitutional system has led to personalistic forms of power. Now, that was clear under Yeltsin, though Yeltsin himself held back a bit because he himself was trying to, I think, in some ways, as best he could, to create somewhat of a liberal system. But under Putin, very much, Putin takes this 1993 constitutional system, famously says, Putin himself, by the way, who's a lawyer, legally trained, takes this constitutional system and uses it ruthlessly to assert his power. So as a result, why does the Russian constitution matter? Well, it is a key aspect and a forgotten aspect of the authority that we see in Russian authoritarianism. I'll now hand over to Peter to speak first, and then we'll turn to Robert.
Thank you, William, for this opportunity to help launch the book. It's a privilege, and I'm excited to talk about what future the book talks about. So it's very tempting to look at the history of modern Russia, the Soviet Union, and the Russian Empire, and conclude that Russia is destined to have centralized power. But the book avoids such simplistic determinism and really looks at the future of Russia with an open mind, for which I'm very thankful. So while Putin personifies this crown presidential form of government, and no reduction in the centralized presidential power is possible during his reign, opportunities for constitutional reform will present themselves to Putin's successors. So the book argues that a president succeeding Putin will face two paths. One is maintaining the status quo or pursuing a proper democratic reform. So a status quo successor is indeed the likeliest option given the current situation. If Putin leaves the office with high approval ratings and perceived success in Ukraine, a status quo successor will be under no pressure to institute any reforms, any constitutional reforms. But if the successor is weak, he will likely build legitimacy through minor changes, such as releasing political prisoners or permitting limited opposition participation. Under a weak successor, some superficial constitutional reforms are possible, but they will likely maintain the concentration of power in the office of the president. Justifications for such continued concentration of power will be the traditional argument that centralized presidential authority is really necessary to prevent the state from disintegration or from civil war. So this would draw upon the historical anxieties about instability and chaos in Russia, often referred to as smuta, or the times of troubles. Real democratic reform is likely to take place only after a proper democratic election, rather than succession from Putin to a member of his inner circle. A democratically elected president is more likely to spearhead constitutional reforms that would help Russia break away from the centralized state tradition and embrace a balanced system that disperses power among institutions. So constitutional changes should focus on three key priorities if such an opportunity arises. One, limiting presidential power and decrees. Two, empowering the legislature to control and remove members of the executive branch. And three, establishing a truly independent judiciary. But importantly, any new structure must carefully balance power to ensure effective governance while preventing the excessive concentration of power in any one individual or institution. A reform system should retain presidential framework while limiting executive power and strengthening the legislature. And another option is a parliamentary system, potentially a semi-parliamentary model with a bicameral parliament elected through both majoritarian and proportional systems. A really important argument that the book is making is that the narrative surrounding potential constitutional reforms is just as important as the content of the reforms themselves. Focusing on international engagement and human rights law, which was the way it was done in the early 1990s, as Will has mentioned, is really problematic. Instead, the democratic movement should emphasize the link between the balanced constitution and good governance. Reformers can argue that limiting centralized power strengthens the state and its ability to serve its citizens and face diverse challenges. So rather than looking for constitutional examples to follow from in the Western democracies, the reformers should look for precedents in Russian history. The book points out that there is a tradition of balanced power in Russian constitutional thinking. Thus, the Constitutional Democrats, a party in the early 20th century, it countered narratives linking centralization to national security, to national strength and security. So, following the embarrassing Russo-Japanese War, Constitutional Democrats convinced the Tsar to set limits on his power and establish a parliament. And while the reforms were only partial, this period coincided with the blossoming of Russia as a major economic power. So the key message that the reformers need to impress on the Russian citizens is that a decentralized, balanced system can unleash the potential of the Russian people and enhance the country's global standing. And I would like to finish my remarks with a brief overview of Alexei Navalny's thinking on the topic of centralized and balanced power. In September 2022, Washington Post published an op-ed by Alexei Navalny, in which he made a very forceful argument in favor of a parliamentary form of government. So Navalny pointed out that in 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we can witness a clear pattern. The countries that chose the parliamentary republic model, such as the Baltic states, they're all thriving and have successfully joined Europe. Those countries that chose presidential parliamentary model, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, they have faced persistent challenges, instability, and various setbacks. And then those countries that chose strong presidential power, like Russia, Belarus, the Central Asian republics, they've all succumbed to a very rigid and ineffective authoritarianism. So Navalny argues that, crucially, parliamentary democracy is also a rational and desirable choice for many of the political factions around Putin. It gives them an opportunity to maintain influence and fight for power while ensuring that they are not destroyed by a more aggressive group. And Navalny makes a very forceful case that the future model for Russia is not a strong power or a firm hand, but harmony, agreement, and consideration of the interests of the whole society. Russia needs a parliamentary republic, Navalny argues. That is the only way to stop the endless cycle of imperial authoritarianism. I'll hand over to Robert.
Well, let me just, I was going to make a quick comment on that because it's one of the things that you raised that Navalny's been speaking about is when we think about a parliamentary republic for Russia, it's important that it be one that is not overly centralized because, of course, parliamentarism can be really centralized itself and personalized in the leader. We think of Viktor Orban in Hungary, right, as a parliamentary system where you have a kind of highly strongman system of government. So one of the suggestions that I make in the book that draws on some of the work of a German scholar is what Peter mentioned is semi-parliamentarism. And what the German scholar is basing semi-parliamentarism on is the Australian system, where you have a lower house that is elected according to kind of first of all, like preferential voting, but you have generally majoritarian, that's the House of Government, and the upper house is proportional representation. And that allows for stable government, so you don't have a lot of kind of coalition governments and so forth, but at the same time, you get checks and balances in the upper house. So it's one thing I think to think about is, because there is a lot of thinking about this, Peter and I have been talking about this, there's a couple Russian groups who are thinking about the new constitution, people are planning for what happens next when Putin leaves. Now, it may not be immediate once he leaves, as Peter's saying, who knows what's going to happen. But, I think there is planning going on and thinking going on, and it's a good thing because one of the key lessons that the Navalny team has done, which I think has been really significant, is they also have been making this link to the 1990s, that the failure of Russian democracy was not a fault of Putin personally alone, but it was also a failure of the system that was created in the early 1990s. And that was called Предатели, was the name of the YouTube, you can watch on YouTube with subtitles, was a really powerful and made a lot of people unhappy, right, who were involved in the 1990s, Khodorkovsky and others, Kasparov and others, who were quote unquote part of the opposition because they were part of this kind of oligarchical system, and they in many cases supported this kind of centralized system. All right, hand over to Robert.
Thank you. It's a great honor to speak at this launching. I think it is difficult to overstate the importance or the timeliness of this book. At its heart is an investigation of the role of the law in the consolidation and survival of an authoritarian state. It offers a persuasive and meticulous analysis of the effects of what Will calls the constitutional dark arts, the idea that constitutional democracy and rights are best secured in a system that which concentrates constitutional power in one elected leader. One thing that makes this idea attractive is the fear of anarchy and extremism. I was in Moscow during the protracted constitutional crisis in the autumn of 1993, when the fractious and dysfunctional parliament was dissolved by President Boris Yeltsin, an elected leader who spoke the language of democratic reform, but who was at the mercy of the hardliners who dominated the legislature. And the result was a fortnight of dual power, clashes in the streets between riot police and crowds of supporters of the parliament, the so-called red-brown opposition, Stalinists, neo-Nazis, imperialist monarchists, and others. And I remember very well the day when those militants broke through mass lines of riot police and for 7 or 8 hours, they appeared to control Moscow. I remember listening to the leaders of the parliament giving speeches from the parliament's balcony while a crowd of neo-Nazis was brandishing semi-automatic weapons around me and going off in trucks to storm the television headquarters. And I remember very well my sense of relief when the rebellion was suppressed and a new, apparently democratic constitution was adopted. After all of the chaos, Russia's elected leader was no longer at the mercy of an irresponsible parliament dominated by radical extremists. And this sense that Russia was now on the right path was widely shared. If you look at the history of the period, if you go back to old newspapers, you'll find lots of optimistic joint declarations from the EU and the Clinton administration about how Russia was being welcomed into the family of Western democracies. What very few paid attention to at the time was the insidious operation of what Will calls the constitutional dark arts. And to notice them, you needed to scrutinize the Constitution's fine print about the distribution of power. You needed to look at the articles that enshrined Yeltsin's guardian powers. The articles like the president's capacity to impose his own prime minister on the parliament, to overcome legislative obstruction, or the fact the Kremlin had quietly revised an article of the draft constitution so that the upper house did not have to be democratically elected. It was democratically elected for the first election, but then that was changed. And you also needed to reflect on the dangers that these rather technical provisions posed for the future of Russian democracy. There are several things that I particularly like about Will's book. Like Piotr, the first is that it rejects cultural determinist stereotypes about Russia. Nowhere does it deny the complexity of Russian culture and the myriad of possibilities that exist within it. Nowhere does it claim that democracy and human rights are civilization-wise alien to Russia, as the celebrated Estonian legal scholar Lauri Malksu recently argued in a recent major volume. Indeed, Will foregrounds Russian dissidents like Andrei Sakharov, who were influential proponents of what we have been accustomed to regard as Western values, as liberal values, as democratic values. And at the same time, he points out that there's nothing particularly unique about the centralist tradition in Russian politics, that it's part of a broader tendency in European thought and constitutional practice. And this is something that makes his message so relevant to us in the West now. The second thing that I like about the book is that it represents a significant contribution to one of my own fields of research about the phenomenon that the Australian scholar Catherine Young and the Irish scholar Graham de Burke have called the misappropriation of human rights. That is to say, the use of human rights language in the service of ends which are exclusionary, repressive, or anti-pluralist in character and evasive of external monitoring or accountability. What Will calls the constitutional dark arts, the idea that constitutional democracy and rights are best secured in a system that concentrates constitutional power in one leader, exemplifies this misappropriation. As he shows in the book, the establishment of Russia's super-presidential system in the early 1990s was accompanied by effusions of official rhetoric about the triumph of human rights. Not only did the Constitution include an extensive human rights chapter, but it also affirmed the supremacy of international human rights agreements over domestic legislation, and the president himself was anointed as the guarantor of the rights and freedoms of citizens. Now, the problem was not merely that these human rights protections in the end didn't protect anybody. By 2012, if not earlier, every basic right that mattered in the Constitution had been nullified in practice. Rather, the problem was that the language of rights had served as a distraction, as an act of misdirection, which made it easier to lay the constitutional foundations of autocracy. Like the proverbial road to hell, the road to Putinism was paved with good intentions wrapped up in the language of constitutional rights. There are a few things I'd add to a discussion of the role of the constitutional dark arts in the making of Putin's dictatorship. The first is that they were made much more dangerous by the survival of authoritarian enclaves, security structures of the Soviet regime, structures that were renamed but never dismantled. Most important was the KGB, the secret police apparatus, founded by founded by Lenin as a Cheka, and responsible for mass repressions that killed millions of people during the course of the 20th century. Unlike many parts of post-communist Eastern Central Europe, these structures continued to shape and to deform political life. For much of the 1990s, the high watermark of Russia's democratization, the former KGB and other power ministries effectively shared power with the elected government. The government was elected, but the government negotiated with those ministries over who from the leadership of those ministries would be the Minister for State Security, who would be the Interior Minister, who would be the Defense Minister. They were never under civilian control. And this problem was compounded by the fact that Russia never underwent lustration. It never prevented the infiltration of state institutions by former KGB officers, by a caste of individuals who had not merely lived under totalitarianism, but served its most brutal, lawless institution. Vladimir Putin, who's always shown pride in his identity as a Chekist, as a KGB officer, was able to reinvent himself as a Democrat, no questions asked. And so were thousands of others. And under Putin's rule, these Chekists became the grave diggers of democracy. A second issue concerns the rise of political technologies, which were developed in the 1990s to manipulate elections and for oligarchs to compete for influence and property. This was another dark art that was perfected by the Russian ruling elite and which was taken up by the Putin regime. It involved extreme levels of political manipulation, the elimination of political challenges by the creation of fake opposition parties, fake opposition organizations, fake opposition politicians, fake media structures, and the resulting derangement of Russia's information space, the warping of public perceptions was a major factor in the consolidation of Putin's dictatorship. And the third issue concerns just how we interpret Putin's first 2 terms as president, which will covers in a chapter titled The Managerial President. In my view, what this minimizes is the importance of the reforms that the Russian political consultant Pavlovsky called the preventive counter-revolution, a set of measures enacted in 2005 to protect Russia from the example of Ukraine's Orange Revolution and other so-called colored revolutions that were sweeping across the former Soviet space. The preventive counter-revolution made Putin's second term very different from his first. On the one hand, it was mobilizational, like its Soviet predecessor. The regime regimented supporters. It got them out onto the streets. It created a massive, aggressively loyalist youth organizations. It enlisted a stable of anti-Western propagandists on state television, and it started to fund its own patriotic civil society under the aegis of the so-called public chamber. And at the same time, the regime destroyed the civic and political forces that threatened to stage a democratic uprising. Restrictions were imposed on civil society. Political parties were decapitated and barred from elections. Many opposition voices were put on stop lists that barred them from appearing on television. And the right to protest was drastically curtailed. All of this, in my view, is much more than managerialism. In a sense, it was another dark art and one that proved extremely effective. The art of disguising a revolutionary transformation of the state, real regime change, by portraying this as an attempt to protect the state from revolution. Thanks.
Thanks, Robert. I think it is very, I think I agree 100% that I think in the way, I mean, the transitional period is very important, I think, right? I mean, so Ernst Frankl, who famously wrote this book, The Dual State, talks about how during periods of transition, law really matters, right? Because what you're doing when you're particularly constitutional laws, you're using arguments to justify actions that you're undertaking. And so that very much, I think, complements what Robert's saying, is the way in which Putin was able to use and justify essentially a fundamental transformation of the state. I mean, we have in the 1990s not a particularly democratic state, but a state that has free media, that has liberal rights, constitutional court that's kind of operating. And by 2008, for two 4-year terms, everything has changed. But what's remarkable about that is how it's justified, and the way in which the work that Robert's done and others have done on like Andrew Wilson, who's done on the political technologies, that the way that the constitutional authority kind of fits with that and says this is how you can build and disguise a process of essentially state transformation. That leads nicely into what I want to talk very briefly about before we do Q&A, which is think a little bit about how these techniques might be working their way into established democracies. I will talk about the United States. I think just as a clearest example, we have a president-elect who has stated on the record that promises made, promises kept. One of those promises is that he will direct the Department of Justice to prosecute on the basis of his own political desires and so forth. There's a lot of discussion about that. What I find more interesting, and I think what the book helps us understand, is the way in which what Robert was calling the technical details, right, are going to be disguised. And this technical details really of essentially power centralization in the office of the United States president and the White House in particular, and this personalization of power will be justified and will be disguised over the next 4 years by claims of democratic constitutionalism and claims of democracy. We've seen just a really small, and I can talk more about it in the Q&A if you're interested. If you read Project 2025, which is the Heritage Foundation is a right-wing political think tank in Washington, D.C. They have talked quite extensively about the importance of the president asserting authority over the headless administrative state. Therefore, and of course, underlying this, they say over and over again, if you read that part of which I was quite interested in, they say that this is the only way to assert democratic accountability, right? So the idea here is that the president will assert authority over the Department of Justice, over independent agencies, potentially over the Federal Reserve Bank, and that Donald Trump, will be doing so because it is more democratic. And one of the, in this case, this would be what I call the constitutional dark arts, a fundamental shift in the organization of the state. But in the American order, it would not necessarily run into constitutional issues for a couple of reasons. One, the Supreme Court is far less willing to scrutinize than they were in the past, one. And second, executive power is, we have in the old traditional kind of 18th century American Constitution, executive power is considered to be one branch, right? There's not, and the divisions that have arisen over time within that to balance powers, as Peter was talking about, are not actually, they're unwritten constitutional norms, and those are quite easy to break, and particularly vulnerable to a system of undermining when it is so technical and so, like most people who listen, who are kind of listen to the news will just be, oh, well, it seems like what he's doing is democratic. We voted for him. We didn't like the establishment. What he's going to do is that's fine. This is, he's our voice, as I'm sure he will tell us again. The idea then of these democratic arguments that are being made, and this I think is one of the really concerning. And there's not just the United States. There are other parts of the world, even Australia, where we're seeing similar trends, infiltrating into our forms of government, and is that the way in which these types of arguments get made and disguised, and misappropriation of rights discourse, misappropriation of democratic theory, democratic arguments, the use of the idea of a mandate, which we've heard Donald Trump say after he, on the night of the election. These types of arguments are very powerful, and I think deserve to be, and I think need to be kind of thought through so that we can counter them. Because there will be, I think, not just a systematic attempt to transform the American state, but one that will be justified in the language of democracy using some of the techniques we see in the constitutional dark arts. And of course, the United States is a different place. doesn't have, as Robert was saying, not too many of these authoritarian enclaves and so forth. It's going to be harder for Trump to do this, but we're going to see how he and his team are going to at least attempt this in the next coming 4 years, and it's something I think that it's important to kind of understand. And the final thing I will say as well, that Russia helps us understand, I think, a little bit about the US, is particularly what personalized power looks like and how it's going to operate. And this is something I think for for Australia and other countries that are dealing with Trump. And we've seen Kevin Rudd, the Australian ambassador to the United States, already delete all of his negative things about Trump on his Twitter account or X account, because he understands now that getting to policy is getting to the president, getting to the White House. So, we see Marco Rubio has been the nomination for the Secretary of State. He will probably be the least important Secretary of State nomination we've ever had, if and he will sail through nomination. But do keep an eye on who he's appointed to as Attorney General. I think that's one of the most significant. Matt Gaetz, who, if confirmed, Matt Gaetz will, I think, be very much part of this effort at transforming the American state in a similar way, disguised in the language of democracy. So I'll turn it to Richard.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to Q&A, but I am going to exploit the privilege of being moderator by asking the first question, which really follows on from that last point you made. So I want to ask about the impact of populism, which is a worldwide phenomenon, including in Russia. And so the question is, in a post-Putin era, is Russian populism going to would it promote constitutional reform, or actually is it going to be one of the major obstacles to constitutional reform?
I think populism is an obstacle to constitutional reform, because populism goes, and this is the argument I make over and over and over in the book, is probably the first populist leader that we had after the end of the Cold War was Boris Yeltsin. And he was a populist that we liked, right? We normally don't like populists in Hungary or Turkey or wherever, because they're illiberal populists, but we had a liberal populist. But one thing that unites populists, whatever their stripe, is centralization of authority, because what they want to do is say, look, I represent the pure people, the whole people. And in that case, if I represent the whole people, what I want and what I deserve and what democracy demands is that I have the authority to capture institutions, to appoint broad ranges of individuals, and to essentially transform the state into my personal vehicle. So I think populism and we need to, one of the final arguments I make in the book is, and I think the Russians tell us, is that Russia is also a good example of a very old populist constitutional system. And it just shows you that these systems are very good at ensuring that a group of people can hold on to power, but they're not very good at actually delivering. And one of the things that got, sadly, tragically, Navalny and his movement banned, and Navalny himself killed in prison, is that they were making this very argument. That they were saying, and going around to the regions, that this system's just not working. Populism doesn't work when you have one leader. It might sound good to have one leader who's your voice, but in the end, it's chaotic. Donald Trump's first term wasn't particularly orderly or effective, and I don't expect this one to be particularly orderly or effective either. Populism is very good at projecting power, but not actually exercising power.
I have a slightly different viewpoint about the potential of populism in authoritarian contexts. When you are facing a regime that is as brutally effective at silencing opposition as the Putin regime is, populism used by the opposition to say they are the elite, they aren't the people. They may speak in the name of the people, but they aren't the people. That can be an effective way of building opposition. And here, I think one crucial question is the opposition using populist methods or also embracing an authoritarian ideology? Populism is often anti-pluralist because of the way it constructs politics as a struggle between the people and elites. But if its political project is pluralist, I might switch this off. Thanks, yeah. If pluralists are campaigning for the distribution rather than the concentration of power, if they are campaigning for the restoration of a democracy based on pluralist principles, then I think in that context they can be a force for progressive change. I mean, this was an argument made in the biography of Navalny by Ben Noble and others, that Navalny was a populist in his methods, but not in his political ideas. And I think that distinction is important.
Yeah, I'll just briefly on that is to say that the book, or the argument I think Navalny's made as well, is that you have a stage 1 and a stage 2, but you need to move away from populism when you rebuild the state. But it can be a very good strategic way in the beginning to undermine. Yeah.
Okay, so questions from the room. We'll start off with Paul Monk, please.
Thanks. That was a terrific tripartite presentation. And I have a copy of the book, and I feel more than ever motivated to read it after the discussion that you three have given us. My question is, what we're seeing in Russia under Putin, we're seeing, it seems, more and more broadly in the world, a trend towards neo-authoritarianism and a kind of crisis of liberal democracy, a kind of sclerosis. And my question would be, first of all, what is driving that? I mean, parenthetically, we talk about democracy and authoritarianism as if the one is good, the other is bad, but it's not, of course, quite so simple. Historically, or right now, there are many democracies that are dysfunctional, and there are different kinds of democracy, some more functional, constitutional even than others. So it seems to me one of the reasons why many people, I surmise, voted for Donald Trump in the recent election is because there's a widespread sense that American democracy has in some respects become dysfunctional, and that neither major party, traditional Republican or Democratic, was offering an agenda that was going to turn things around. It doesn't mean that voting for Trump was a good idea, but it seems to me that it may have motivated a lot of people to vote for him. And let me conclude what throwing up in the question to you about this perspective in terms of neo-authoritarianism spreading. Of all people, Neil Ferguson, who I have a lot of respect for intellectually and whom I'm acquainted with personally, wrote a piece in the Weekend Australian extolling the victory of Trump as a breakthrough of this kind, which astonished me, to be honest. If somebody like Neil, with his historical knowledge and grasp of what can lead to dictatorship, can take that view, where do we go in terms of arguing for the resurgence of an authentic and effective democracy?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, one way to think of it is, at least, and the final chapter, I think a little bit about what, if we're thinking about, or what I call kind of rebuilding a kind of democratic constitutionalism, is thinking about constitutionalism and a democratic constitution as being not just about, avoiding the concentration of power, but also allowing for effective power, right? And that's where balance comes from. And I think one of the lessons that I often talk to when I think about, when I talk to people who are thinking of a new Russian constitution, they're saying, okay, we need to limit the power of the president. We need to decentralize radically, blah, blah. The concern you have with that is that you then create ineffective power and you get too many checks and balances. And I think, the example of the United States is a very good example where there are too many checks and balances that allow too much of these kind of lobbyists and private groups to dominate. And I think a lot of the anger that we saw that was channeled by Donald Trump and his movement, as he calls it, it is a movement. It is not a part of the traditional Republican Party or certainly the Democrat, is a response to the fact that liberal democracy has kind of in some ways lost its way. And I argue in the book that in some ways a liberal democracy kind of has a bit of a blindness to power. how do we create effective power, right? We need effective power, but power that is not too effective, that it's centralized to the point where you have authoritarian power. But getting the balance right is, I think, the question we need to think about now. So for the US, it's thinking about, why do you have a filibuster in the Senate on bills? Nothing gets through, so you can't get actually any effective. You have vast majorities of Americans who support some form of gun control in some areas, but you have a court that's blocked it through the Second Amendment. So you have these kinds of ways in which the system has, I think, got too many checks and balances, and it leads to just a lot of unhappiness. You know, I sometimes listen to, you know, the kind of bro podcasters like Joe Rogan and Theo Vaughn, and they, you know, it's fascinating to see they were very interested in Bernie Sanders, right? So these guys are not and particularly interested in the left or the right. What they're interested in is they are unhappy with the system, and it very much, I think, when Kamala Harris gave her final closing address in front of the White House in Washington D.C. was a real mistake, right? And she was campaigning with Liz Cheney, the daughter of Dick Cheney, you know, very much part of the establishment in the final 2 weeks. So the Democrats became the symbolism of the establishment. And the danger and the tragic story, I hope this doesn't get, is that, you know, there is, I think, a desire in America for something new. But what they're going to do is bring in a guy like Trump, who has these tendencies towards centralization and so forth, that will really not help anyone, in fact, make things worse, because you'll just degrade institutions and create personalism.
Hello, Galina, Ukraine. Russia adopted 5 regions of Ukraine in its constitution. This is a territory like to Switzerland. Now situation on front line developing dramatically. Where will Putin stop?
A question for Richard, really, or I mean, you know, like, I mean, I'm not a military expert, but what I will say is that, you know, you raised the, you know, the use of constitutions for kind of performative. That's another example of why constitutions matter, why the Russian Constitution matters, why they would. Now, of course, I don't think yet formally they've put this into the Constitution. Is it? They formally amended it. Yeah, so that in that case, it's a very clear that they're trying to say this is set in stone, right? This is where you're gonna. How far he'll go is, I think, a question of how far he's allowed to go by, you know, the West and NATO, and how much support we continue to give him, and that will be a question of Donald Trump. It's very clear now that, you know, that given the personalization of power in not just Russia, but now in the United States, that it will be a bilateral deal between Trump and Putin. They're going to sit down at some stage and make a deal. And sadly for Ukraine, they're going to be cut out of that deal likely. They're just going to have to, there'll be, but it's, yeah, I mean, do you have thoughts on this?
I'm curious if there are any other constitutions in the world that actually sort of put specific territories. It seems very highly unusual.
Certainly not that have been, you know, I mean, what's so remarkable about this is, of course, since World War II, there's been a very strong rule of international law that we do not conquer territory and take territory through violence, right? And to put that into a constitution is a clear sign of how Putin understands constitutions. And I will say at this point, there is a lot of discussion that before Putin leaves, either if it's this term or next term, within the next 6 to 12 years, that before he leaves, he will fundamentally put in a new constitutional order altogether. What will be a Putin constitution, which will, and that's the idea that constitutions, and we saw this with the 2020 amendments, particularly, they're about projecting a kind of normative order, and this will be that, what he's trying to do. So I think that's what we're going to see.
I agree with most of Will's analysis of this point, but I very much doubt whether Putin will leave power peacefully. Essentially, as the world's greatest kleptocrat, he can't hand over power to anyone else without that person being under enormous pressure to distance themselves from Putin and from his corruption by taking action against it. Kleptocrats are different to other politicians. Almost any other politician, even if they're authoritarian rulers, can expect a relatively comfortable retirement and a place on the international speakers circuit or whatever. Putin knows that if he withdraws from power, there's a very good chance he'll end up in jail. There's a very good chance worse will happen. And as far as what's likely to happen in Ukraine, almost everything as far as Putin's conduct depends not on Russia's national security. I don't think calculations of what was in Russia's geopolitical interest or NATO expansion or any of that is a significant factor. It's all about regime security. It's about reinforcing Putin's personal power and essentially reinforcing the system that emerged from the dark arts that are the subject of Bill's book.
Thanks very much. I've got two questions. The first question is much more generic, and that is, in view of your work in looking at constitutions that have got a lot of human rights guarantees, but then at the same time, actually raw power, so to speak, overrides a lot of that. To what extent do we think that a lot of what in the political science world they call democratic backsliding or rise of authoritarianism in the past, 15, 20, 30 years, really need to force human rights lawyers to rethink how they pitch their work and how they pitch their case around the world, because in the post-war international law order, and even which seeps through to various domestic constitutions, it's almost like human rights is a given, and that if you breach these rights, then no, you should just comply with all of that. And there is a complete, well, is it ignorance or is it a deliberate attempt not to see the power side of all of these things? So is there a need for human rights lawyers to rethink how they do things? That's the first question. And the second question actually came from a mixture of an observation that Peter made and something that Richard said. And that is this idea that in Russia, you were saying that there's this traditional idea that, if we don't have a strong man, then society will break down, there'll be disintegration, everything. Actually, you hear that concept a lot in China as well. You certainly heard that concept a lot, for example, during Suharto's time in Indonesia. And turning to Richard's point about populism, one of the things that tends to happen historically when a strong man retires or steps down in whatever way is that populism becomes turbocharged, because you've got a bunch of people who's been used to politics being a zero-sum game, who's lost their voice, and suddenly they've got their voices back, and it does become a self-fulfilling prophecy almost, that very chaos that everyone warns about happens. Like we saw that in the late 90s in Indonesia, for example. We saw that in the late 80s, early 90s in Taiwan to a certain extent. Now, some places like Indonesia and Taiwan survived through that and became to various degrees democracies. But how much of that is luck? How much of that is design? And I guess my question on all of that is, we know what the end point needs to be once a strong man stepped down, which is we need sort of what Will calls effective but relatively decentralized power. But how do we get there when we've got turbocharged populism that sees democracy in almost authoritarian terms as a zero-sum game, because that's the only thing that the people have ever known for decades?
I think also, I mean, to that second one, I mean, some people refer to this as the authoritarian trap. So you centralize authority in a person, and then that system collapses because either the person dies in office or something happens. And of course, then you get chaos, then you do get chaos, right? So the whole idea, and this is what, Peter and Robert both pointed out, like, this idea of what I call a centralized state tradition is everywhere in the world, and particularly strong in places that have experienced state breakdown. And, so China is an example, or state weakness, right? Where you feel like you really want to reestablish authority. And of course, you want to have authority. Everyone knows, I mean, in Libya is a good example. You decapitate the state, or Iraq, you decapitate the state, you create chaos, anarchy. No one wants that. You're better off with a strongman than you are with nothing, no authority. But the problem, of course, in these authoritarian strongman systems is that the personalization gets so strong, and then the individual, the person of the strongman leaves, and the system just collapses, right? And then, so how do you break out of that trap? That's the question. One of the things I point out in the book is temporary constitution. So you can have a centralized form of authority for a short period of time. And there's a lot of, including Mikhail Khresnov, who's a very, very widely regarded constitutional law professor in Russia now, who has said he regrets the way the 93 Constitution went through, but he doesn't regret this constellation of power. He regrets that it wasn't a temporary. In 5 years, and then you have a new constitutional order that you can then, that you needed, as Robert was saying, you had state breakdown in 1993. You had essentially almost civil war in Moscow. If that spread in a nuclear armed state, it would be horrible for everyone, right? Not just the Russians. So you need some form of authority, but you don't want to have that as an entrenched constitutional order. The second thing is to go to this idea of what does this teach for human rights lawyers? And I think I'm glad you asked this question. I think human rights lawyers need to look at power more closely. The problem with a lot of human rights groups is that they think, okay, just get checklists. Okay, Sudan's got a whole lot of rights in their constitution. Great, you're a democracy. You get the checklist, whatever. Saudi Arabia, you got your rights provisions. Yeah, so you've got all kinds of different kind of ways in which human rights lawyers themselves are unwilling or unable. I think in some cases it's unwilling to look at power, because power is where, because the foundation of rights protection is a balanced system, right? You're never going to have a court operating independently in a system of centralized strongman government, ever, right? The court will always eventually get captured. So you need balance to ensure that. So one of the takeaways from the books, the fundamental takeaways from the books from a political theory point of view, is we need to see rights don't control power, power controls rights. And if we're looking at constitutional design, constitutions themselves, we need to be looking at power first, then rights.
Well, that is actually a really powerful way to end. So thank you. It's been a really extraordinary evening. I've learned an enormous amount. I'm not sure whether to be encouraged or depressed by it all. But what I can recommend, if there's anybody who hasn't yet got one of these, we'll be signing them right now. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.